Really excited to be on here today. I guess, it's an interesting question going back to your entrepreneurial roots because I could definitely start at, the lemonade stands, starting age 8.
Exactly.
I was definitely, kind of a salesperson, even as a little kid. But I would say, the thing that really inspired Female Founders Fund was the company that I co-founded prior to the fund, which is called Exclusively In. So, Exclusively In, think of it as guilt for Indian products, taking Indian retail brands and making them accessible outside of India. This was in 2009 to 2011. And, as an entrepreneur, it was really my first exposure to the world of tech entrepreneurship. So, kind of the roller coaster ride of really fast growth, hiring a ton, making really strategic decisions with very little information, and most importantly, raising venture capital. And I think the experience of pitching, primarily all male investors for a business that was, had a ton of female employees, had a lot of female managers, and was really marketing to a primarily female customer base was pretty eye opening. And for me, after we were acquired, and I moved to New York and started doing some angel investing, it really made me question, how is this a viable model? And we all know less than 2% of venture capital goes towards women, and there's a lot of work to be done in the space. And so for me, what really inspired me was not just the opportunity to, raise a pool of capital, but more importantly, to develop a really strong ecosystem. In those days, you went to a tech event in New York and it was really just all bros. And it was not a environment that was necessarily, friendly towards female founders. And so I felt like there was really an opportunity to build an ecosystem that provided capital, but also more importantly, just a network of other women who were building, businesses in their own right.
Now we're gonna go a bit deeper on this, but I wanted to take you back a little bit again to the e-commerce company that you started, and just say a little bit more about the problem you were solving or the opportunity that you saw. Because I love, the founder's passion, and that
Yeah.
passion can get through a lot of challenges and bumps, but a little bit more about that, because that obviously established a lot of your credibility going into this much bigger, arguably more important endeavor.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say, my parents moved to India about 20 years ago. And, I've been going back very often. Prior to business school, I'd actually opened India's first wine bar. So
Aha.
I was pretty bullish on just the opportunity, both in India as well as just around Indian products and services. And I would say that, for me as an entrepreneur, having exposure to the breadth of Indian retail had been, amazing. And I remember even in college, I used to sell pashmina shawls to my friends because they just had no access to products like that. And so when we looked at the guilt model, my co-founders and I, it was pretty clear that there was a really interesting opportunity to bring Indian retail brands outside of India in a very kind of technology forward way,
Mhm.
and really for the first time have this kind of array, everything from home to fashion to jewelry, all of these different categories be accessible to not just Indians outside of India but also to a wider
Yeah.
market.
So yeah, and what I'm sure was so interesting about that is you probably were thinking there's so many other opportunities that can be taken full advantage of in this fast
Yeah.
growing internet space. So let's go back to the present. You use the number 2%. I read 2%, 3%. I almost feel like we've seen these statistics so much we've almost become numbed by
Yeah.
them. But that's a pretty alarming statistic. And so what's going on in your view that only 2 to 3% of businesses out there are founded by women? Probably the percentage of VC firms led by women is even lower. But can we just talk a little bit about some of the root causes and whether you're seeing
Yeah,
Any
definitely.
encouraging movement right now beyond just what you're doing?
Yeah, so I'll start off by saying, as an entrepreneur, I'm always an optimist, and we're
Yeah,
betting on the future,
me too.
and the fact that the future will get better over time.
Hmm.
And I guess I'll start by pointing out to a study that we started in 2013, and the goal of the study was really to track, how is funding for women changing and evolving over time. So to give you a stat that I think is relevant, in 2013, when we were kind of starting out, there was one Series A round that was led by a female founder, and that was Shanlin Mav Zola. In 2018,
Wow.
if you look at how far we have come, there were 18 Series A rounds led by female founders in New York. And the reason I think that stat is interesting is because you can look at high level numbers all day long, but ultimately
Yeah.
the change is going to start at the bottom, right? So if you can't
Mhm.
raise a Series A, you're never going to raise $100 million round. And so I think that is a really good indicator of change. I also think New York as an ecosystem, if you look at last year, the first three unicorns, Glossier, Away, and Rent the Runway, all came out of New York in 1 year, and that had never happened before. This year, we saw the $500 million acquisition by Bryn from Mirror. So I think that things are definitely moving in the right direction, but it's going to take time, and we're betting on that future. So we feel optimistic about it.
Can you comment briefly on the impact of network effects? So you started 2013, ridiculously low numbers, kind of built to, a point where you started to almost kind of create network effects within New York. What is critical mass where you start to see a difference? This is a very relevant question we're thinking about in Cincinnati because our numbers have a lot to be desired. Um, and I'm trying to think like what is critical mass where it really starts to pick up meaningful momentum? Was there a
Yeah.
period where you just said, okay, it's starting to you know uh, the opportunities are starting to bounce off one another?
Yeah, so I would say that in New York, as it relates to women, I think we've seen two phases in a sense. So things really started with companies like Gill, Rent the Runway, Birchbox. There are a few others as well during that era. And these were all, pretty incredibly innovative, but also, the first time we were seeing women lead companies in the technology space. And I think that inspired really that next generation, and the second phase of talent. So you not only had women who worked at these companies as well as Google, Facebook, Instagram, they had developed the right skill sets, but we're now taking those skill sets and very much being inspired by what they had seen with this first kind of phase of founders. And so I do think it happens over time. And there is a generational impact in terms of, if you are even an employee working at one of these larger companies, the skill set, the insights that you are
Yeah.
gathering are very relevant for that second phase.
Tell me about some of the success criteria you look for in any type of founder. But I noticed that I was going through a number of your tweets and LinkedIn posts, and I noticed that you retweeted something from Dan Rose about just the importance of the CEO as salesperson. Can you talk a little
Yeah,
bit more
definitely.
about what that means?
Yeah, so I think that one of the most underrated skills, or one that doesn't really get a lot of attention, is the fact that your CEO is effectively selling all day long, right? So you're selling to potential employees, you're selling to potential investors, you're selling to
Yeah.
potential advisors, you're selling to potential customers, and you may have the best idea, but if you can't articulate it in a way that's convincing, to all of these groups, then it's going to be really hard to scale. And so I think that is a quality that we really that ranks very highly for us as we look to work with different founders.
And how about from your end? You're obviously you're selling a vision, but you're also selling a fund.
Yeah,
that you're
absolutely.
trying to grow? And is it getting easier? Has COVID opened up some doors? Has it closed doors? Has the value proposition of your portfolio companies become more relevant in this context? I mean, and how are you getting that message across?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think overall, I've been doing this now for 8 years, and I would
Yeah.
say by far fundraising has been the most challenging part of the journey. And I think anytime you're kind of one of the first to develop a thesis that is yet unproven, it's going to be challenging. I think that what we have in our favor is two back-to-back large $100 million plus exits,
Mhm.
and there's nothing like returning capital to investors.
Yes,
um,
yes.
but I think at the end of the day, the challenge is it really comes from kind of the more traditional institutions who have a hard time kind of believing that this strategy of investing in women is a long-term strategy. And from our perspective, when you have 400 plus kind of micro funds that look primarily the same, winning is all about differentiation. And what we've built is, I think, unparalleled in terms of an ecosystem and a community. And so, our belief is that as a female founder, you can't really get that anywhere else.
I mean, one of the things that we have lots of debates over this because we're trying to really think through the whole, you know, meaningful impact we can have on D&I. And one of the, and it's more than just D&I, it's really like the best, really opening up the best innovation for for our LPs and others. But is there is there a, like where else is there do you think there's any type of broader, not bias, but just bad habit towards not being open to, everyone talks about experienced founders, you have to have been around the track many times. And I've often asked myself, okay, how do you really open up the doors to those that are really kind of carving out the new territory? I'm still trying to get the heart out. Like, why are we still at 3% in 2020? Like, is there anything else that's just that we're not, is there, what else
Well, I think you have to
should we
start.
be, what other hard issues should we be thinking about on that front?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to go back to where we started, right? And even going from 2 to 3% when you're talking in billions is actually a meaningful jump. And I think that, I completely get your point, but it takes time, right? So if today we were to back a founder, just to give you an example, for her to go on to raise, even 200 million is going to take 6, 7 years, right?
Mhm.
So we addressed the problem and pointed it out not that long ago. So to expect that, you're going to be able to fast forward and
Yeah.
have women raising, billions or hundreds of millions, is just, I don't think, realistic. I think it's more important to track the, those early rounds, because you need to see those convert. You need to see those companies go on to
Okay.
be successful, and you need to see exits, right?
So
There's
let's,
nothing that
okay.
drives
So
investors
that's a,
more
yes.
than FOMO.
So that's a fair push. So let's go back to some of those examples of wins in the Female Founders Fund column. What were they? What did you learn? And where could that lead to? I think one of them related to, a company where we have quite a few folks on the call right now. That was Billy. And I think you were one of the early
Yeah, we led
investors
the
there.
seed
But,
round. Yeah.
tell us about some of the wins.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say with Billy, um, and you and I have talked about this as well, the role that brand and Instagram has to play in really understanding the ethos of, what differentiates this razor and this experience from everything else that is out there, is incredibly important as investors in the consumer space. And I would say with Billy, it was a few things that I think caught our attention. So number one, as a category, razors are incredible. Effectively a subscription product, very little churn. So it was definitely an area that we were watching. And our point of view was that for a brand like Dollar Shave Club or Harry's to do it well, um, is possible, but it has to come from the authentic voice of a
Yeah.
female to really resonate with, I think, a female audience. And so when we met Georgie and Jason, Georgie's background was incredibly relevant. She had worked at Wieden and Kennedy, worked on Old Spice, really truly understood, I think, how to build a voice from a brand perspective.
Yeah.
And more importantly, I think understood the social issue that Billy could address, which I think is imperative in today's
Mhm.
day and age as a consumer product brand. So it's great that you're building a razor company, but why? Right. And for them, the answer was very simple. You look at the sexualization of women in razor ads historically, it's ubiquitous. There's no hair on
Yeah.
women's legs and they look perfect. And that's just not realistic. And so we saw the brand campaigns, we saw the branding, we tried the product, and it was a no-brainer. And so I think that, they truly kind of lived out that value proposition in the sense that, won a ton of awards for their advertising, papered the New York subway with Billy ads. And I think young women resonated. They kept coming up with, campaigns that pushed the edge, and really were thought provoking. And it became more than just a razor company.
And I presume you've concluded that there's probably a lot more Billies out there kind of looking for, you know, a future parent or acquirer because
Yeah, it's not easy to do.
what?
So I think there are definitely companies out there, but it's not an easy thing to do.
Say more.
So, I mean, I think, we looked at probably at least 10 other companies in the space. And so, I would say that there are many out there. Are they the right combination of founder talent and experience, product market fit, and brand? That's harder to find.
Yeah. I think your point, I've told you this many times after that breakfast. I've always fixated on your observation about Instagram because my experience at Nestle when I led digital for 8 years, we would pull our hair out trying to figure out like why these small ankle biter, almost like underfunded, players were just grabbing market share in the food category. And we'd always come up with a lot of different reasons. Sometimes but when you'd spend time looking at the way they communicated through the social channels, especially Instagram, we see some of that now with TikTok. It's a different language. It is an intuitive understanding. It is a fluency with the new consumer that I think big brands continue to struggle with, and that even paid advertising still doesn't
Yeah.
fill the gap. And I just think that's really powerful to really like, what are the new filters that almost serve as that 80-20 gut check on whether they fundamentally get it or
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
And I kind of put my own relevance to that filter as well from am I credible talking about, communication or future marketing, based on how well I know those channels.
Yeah.
What else is in your pipeline that's really exciting you? You don't have to get into all the secret sauce, but I'm sure there's sectors or opportunity spaces that you're thinking a lot about now.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have obviously been very closely tracking coronavirus, the impacts, both on our portfolio companies, but also on consumer behavior, as well as just the companies that are being developed today that are keeping in mind kind of our new world order. And so, a couple of the spaces that I think we're tracking. So, one would be digital health.
Uh-huh.
I think that, as more and more consumers have become comfortable with, at home diagnoses and have realized the efficiency of being able to, connect with a doctor or health practitioner from your home, that's going to fundamentally shift behavior patterns and just provide more efficiency for everybody. So, we have a couple investments, women's health, mental health, alcohol addiction, all in that space. And I think there's more opportunity to come. I think, we looked at, what are the areas from a consumer spending perspective that actually have gone up during COVID. And I would say, there's a term that economists had coined, the lipstick effect. And I think that's linked to the
The
fact
lipstick effect,
that
right?
beauty is an affordable luxury for women. And they don't feel guilty about buying. They can't afford the new handbag or the new expensive outfit, and they're also not really going anywhere. But they are on Zoom calls, and they do want to take care of themselves. And so beauty is a category where both Billy as well as Winky Lux, that I mentioned, have done incredibly well during this phase. And then third, I would say, this is not surprising,
That's
but
such an interesting area. I almost wonder, like, will Olay start producing their versions of green screens, right?
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
it's the definition of, yeah, the tent of beauty is going to be much broader
yes,
and
yeah.
probably more accessible.
Yeah, or filters
Yeah.
for Zoom, Zoom screens also, I think will be really interesting. Um, the last category I would say is workplace efficiency. So, we're obviously all on living our lives now on Zoom and House Party and these other platforms, but I think there's a lot of room to improve that experience. And so just kind of tracking what's happening in that space as well.
Okay. Now I have a lot of questions, and I'm going to let ask one more, and then I'm going to have Catherine open up to a few questions. I'm sure we've got a few comments coming in, but I did want to drill down a little bit on your first category around digital health. And I noticed on one of your tweets, I think is Feels one of your portfolio companies. I think Gwyneth Paltrow just invested in it.
Real,
Um,
yeah.
Real,
Yeah.
yeah. So can you comment a little bit more on the mental health space? I sense that, number one, some of the taboos are clearly collapsing around just talking about it openly, but it's also a category that I think we all know is close to what we're going through in the whole area. So do you see that area kind of both growing and maybe becoming more accessible?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think so Ariella Safira, the founder of Real, I met her, early last spring. And I think mental health was an area that we were very interested in. And there was a lot of activity in the startup space. The opportunity that I felt was important was not just creating a new space for therapy, like a physical clinic, but actually rethinking the experience of therapy so that there was actually more of an outcome focused product experience. And by that, I mean, instead of going to a therapist in an open-ended cadence, why not create pathways that are actually focused on solving specific issues? So it could be a couple of examples, pathways that Real has developed: death of a parent, or handling a miscarriage, or co-parenting during COVID. And these are all, 12 kind of sessions over the course of 12 weeks. And, you know exactly what you're going to be discussing. You can send notes to your therapist, you can track medication, and it provides for a much more fruitful, I think, experience on both sides. And Real also did a great job of bringing in younger therapists who actually can relate much more to their customers, a lot more diverse. So LGBTQ, racially diverse. And so I think that was very innovative. And I think that, they've since pivoted to create a digital product where you can essentially sign up for salons that are focused on, again, these pathways that I mentioned, but they're asynchronous. So you have a therapist leading them, and you have a group of, 15 to 20 women who are participating anonymously and can ask questions, and kind of, these are becoming cohorts that every week kind of tune into. And so again, just rethinking that mental health experience, and to your point, very much normalizing it during is a very.
I really like that, especially the thinking around those seminal moments or change points. I agree. I think it's a big opportunity space. I was just a judge on the P&G Ventures open innovation pitch competition, and one of the top players was a company that kind of converged mental health and augmented and virtual reality, which I thought was really
Oh,
interesting on
wow.
the diagnostic side. But it definitely got me thinking that, that is, there's just going to be a lot of innovation there. And
Yep.
thank you for sharing that. Catherine, do we have any good questions that we want to share with Anu during a pause in my Q&A?
Yes, we do. Okay, this one's from April. How early do you invest in consumer technology companies? What sort of proof are you looking for in a pre-revenue company, for example, Reel and Peanut?
So, in terms of consumer companies, it varies, would be the best answer. Depends on the point at which we meet the founder, how much capital they're raising. So for example, Peanut, we actually invested post-launch, whereas Reel, we invested pre-launch. So we're open to doing both. It really just depends on, when we meet the founder, how much capital they're raising, and what industry they're in.
Okay, thank you. All right, we have another one. This one is from an anonymous submitter. I noticed the FFF COVID update that marketing is an expense that is going down for ventures. I'm wondering how VCs are advising these digital native products to cut back, but also not get lost in the digital noise.
So what's happened that I think is really interesting is that we typically, in the beginning of COVID, had told all our portfolio companies to cut back spend digitally. And I think, since COVID, we've obviously seen, Black Lives Matter. It's a very, I think, turbulent time period where, doing kind of expansive advertising is probably not what I would recommend. But as a result of that, we've seen CAC come down actually pretty significantly, cost of customer acquisition. And so we now have companies that have actually restarted, doing advertising online, just to really take advantage of this opportunity right now.
Great. And this one is from Abby. How do you suggest first-time founders get their foot in the door when they're not ready for a funding round, but know they will be in the near future? Are there any resources you recommend to start educating yourself?
Yeah, so I would say it's important to kind of develop a founder community, because I do think that, as you're going through the journey, it's really important to have a peer group. And so, basically it could mean a variety of different things in today's, kind of COVID world. But using Twitter, using social media, to kind of identify folks that are at the same stage, can be really impactful.
Awesome.
You're doing great. Keep going.
Okay, yeah, we have a couple more. Let's see. So there are some in the chat. If the attendees would like to drop them in the Q&A tool, that would be ideal. So another one about FFF. How do you and FFF think about highlighting and recognizing female operators and founders in more male-centric, less trendy sectors like logistics or insurance? Are there any strategies you recommend?
How do we think about highlighting founders? That's a good question. I mean, we have a content strategy that focuses on highlighting founders both in our portfolio, but also outside of our portfolio. And I think that, we're always open to introductions to other founders in spaces like logistics. So, I would say, unfortunately, there are definitely less of them. But, whether it's having them on a panel or, being able to do a fireside chat with them, it's definitely something we're open to.
Excellent.
All right, should we keep going or go back?
Yeah, throw one more and then I'll jump in. I've got a few more.
Okay. All right. Who are you collaborating with to drive your movement to support female founders?
So I would say that, when you think about collaboration, there's different ways to define it. So, in terms of our investor base, we're lucky enough to have, I think, some of the most incredible women leaders and entrepreneurs. So, whether it's Melinda Gates, Whitney Wolfe Herd from Bumble, Anne Wojcicki from 23andMe, Susan Wojcicki from YouTube. I think being able to bring those women into the fold and also provide them access to, I think, what's happening from an innovative standpoint in kind of the startup world is a benefit for both sides. We also have actually brought in, so almost all of our founders from our first fund are now investors in our second fund. And we've, reduced the check size to really enable them to also be a part of the upside. So that's kind of how we've thought about, creating that ecosystem.
Can I build on that one? Can you talk a little bit more about just the role and the art and the impact of networking? It kind of goes back to my earlier question, but I forget the label that you used, but you said something about being an inherent optimist, and I kind of went through like hundreds of your tweets just trying to get to better know you and your passion points and your expertise. And one thing I noticed that really stood out, I noticed that you are incredibly generous with thank yous to folks vis-a-vis your tweets. And I've always felt that gratitude is kind of a great part of just building and nurturing the network. But whether it's that or mentorship, like what makes networks work? And because I think we've got the building blocks here in Cincinnati, but I know we can kind of take it to the next level. And I know we obviously have reach far beyond Cincinnati, but what are the other things we should be thinking about from a just building great network effects?
That's a great question. I think that, what's worked well for us has really been about brand, first and foremost. And so if you think about brand as like the end goal, content and community are the other two parts.
Yeah.
And so having a point of view around, a specific issue, in our case, female founders are the future, has really drawn people to us with that same point of view. So on the content side, I think what we've done well is really leverage our platform to highlight women.
Mm-hmm.
And so we do that, on a weekly, bi-weekly basis through our newsletter. We do that through events that we use to showcase women both in our portfolio, outside of our portfolio. And I think those two things combined have enabled us to rise above just being a fund and more of a connector and the center of, I think, a really strong ecosystem.
And what about mentors? Do you owe any of your success to mentors that have played a key role in your life? And do you, obviously you play a mentorship role with all of your portfolio companies, but could you just comment on that area of growth?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think for me personally, being completely new to VC, there were a few people that were really helpful. So Josh Koppelman at First Round was really helpful. More recently, we have Lo Tony from Plexo Capital, who's been really, really helpful. Kathleen Utacht from Core Venture Capital has been very, very helpful. So I would say, having kind of an informal group of people to lean on as you're making decisions and thinking through, different options has been really helpful.
And then when you're saying, obviously all of us, and we have to say no a lot before we say yes. When you're talking to a promising, founder or set of founders that have, or they're on a really big idea but might not just be the right fit for you, how do you say no while keeping them empowered and keeping them in the game?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question, and it's very hard.
Yeah,
But we try to be honest, and we try not to waste too much time with founders that we're not moving forward with. What we do, and most recently with our newly launched website, which everyone should check out, is we've
it's excellent.
created a database of
Excellent.
founder resources. So the idea is that we may not be able to invest, but there's a list of other female angel investors, or here's advice on how to do a great deck. So I think that hopefully
Yeah.
provides some nugget of value to them on their journey.
We talked earlier about an interesting initiative with Target. Can you say a little bit more about that? I thought that was really interesting.
With Target.
Was one of your portfolio companies that
Oh yeah,
released
yeah.
a product? Yeah,
Yeah, so one of our companies, Winky Lux, which
yeah.
is a beauty brand, actually had incredible timing. So in February of this year, launched in all Target stores, and for the first time ever, and actually has been one of the most successful beauty launches to date, and is expanding, the end cap in 2021. So, going back to my point about the lipstick effect, I think we're definitely seeing that in stories like this one.
Okay, outstanding. Catherine, any more questions coming in that we want to cover off?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Based off your journey from having a business model to finding investors, what's been the challenge there and how do you go about networking? Also, did investors funded startup on the first pitch, or what are the mindful parameters we should check on a pitch deck, and how we need to be prepared beyond the pitch deck?
So I would say, a pitch deck is a pitch deck. And, if you go to our website, we have a couple great articles in terms of like what should be in there, and what you should highlight. But I think what investors are really looking for is authenticity in your story. So why are you building this? Are you building this because, you want to be an entrepreneur? It's cool. Or are you building it because you actually are really passionate about doing something for the next 10 years and you live and breathe solving this problem? And so that I think is really important in kind of success for many founders.
Okay, thank you. Um, will you be looking to invest at India-based startups as well?
Not at the moment. We're US focused.
Okay. And this one's from Emily. How does Female Founders Fund want to engage younger professionals to excite them about the female-centered VC space?
So we do a ton of events, and we really use that as a way of highlighting, like I said, both female founders, female investors. So, if you subscribe to our newsletter, I think it's a great way to just remain up to date with what's happening in the world of VC.
Okay. How do you suggest finding funding for passion products that are, or projects that are more service oriented and heading towards the nonprofit direction?
So I'm not an expert in that, but I think there's a big difference between nonprofit and a for-profit. And I think it does kind of go back to my earlier point about being able to articulate why you're doing what you're doing and showing the passion behind it. I think that is relevant to both, for-profit and nonprofit, potential donors or investors. So I'd really hone in on your story and being able to tell it in a succinct, compelling manner.
Okay, so we have a couple students on the line. This one's from Irene. She says, what advice do you have for young women of color in college interested in a career in venture capital? How might young women be able to contribute to the work being done at the Female Founders Fund?
So Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that there's a ton of resources now out there, particularly in light of Black Lives Matter. So signing up for Black VC, they do a ton of work, whether it's events, networking, et cetera, for people of color who are looking to be in VC. So that's a great starting place. I think there are also lists of people to follow on Twitter. So, following folks that are kind of leaders in this space, I think is really important. As a fund, we're not really hiring at the moment, but you know, would love to kind of have you attend our events and get a sense of what we're building at Female Founders Fund.
Okay. This one is from Kevin. In addition to learning from the wins, can you discuss some learnings from failures?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are so many reasons why a company fails, and so we have seen, obviously, like any VC fund, our share of those, and I think it varies, right? It can come down to what I mentioned earlier, a founder that doesn't necessarily have that sales ability, and that's something we've definitely learned, along the way. I think it can be timing, so not being able to find product market fit and raise enough capital around it. And then I think it can be drive, making
Yeah,
sure that if you're a second time founder, are you truly driven in the same way you were the first time around?
great one.
Yeah. All right, we have a couple more. From this one's from Eric. From a VC perspective, which troubles you more? The deal that got away or the deal that won't get off the ground?
Mm, good question.
Probably the deal that got away. Because if we invested in a company, at least we put everything into it and it was out of our control in regards to, kind of how it went versus, not investing. I think, it's harder to wrap your head around that.
Okay. And can you give some examples of compelling mission-driven companies in your portfolio?
Yeah, so I would say we're not an impact fund, so that's not part of our criteria. But a lot of these companies are obviously, we are hoping, making the world a better place. So whether it's Maven Clinic, Real, Tala, those are just a few examples in our portfolio.
All right. Let's see. I think there might be a couple more, but Pete, do you have any questions for Anu before?
Yeah, I did.
Things up?
I'll give you two that you can pick your favorite. But the any key influencers, folks you follow on Twitter, authors on Medium that inspire you that you might recommend to others? And then secondly, we talked about Instagram, but are there other channels that are emerging that you think are having a similar impact where we're kind of seeing unique marketing, communication, almost intuitive ability kind of emerge? TikTok's an obvious example.
Yeah, of
but
course.
are there others that you're sort of saying, boy, if they've figured this out, then, there's a lot of potential. They could probably conquer any marketing channel.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say it's interesting. It's an interesting period right now for Instagram. I think a lot of influencers, even amongst our own portfolio founders, are struggling to kind of figure out the best tone to take. So
Yeah.
we're almost at kind of a standstill where I think it's opportune for new platforms to emerge. I think TikTok is a great example. It's effectively a platform for joy, and that's exactly what people need right now. And so, we're definitely still kind of tracking social, but I also think that we're going to start to see things change and
Yeah.
new platforms develop as well.
I love that platform for joy. That's spot on, and much, very, very much in need right now.
Yes.
The other question is actually, Catherine mentioned a couple of student questions. On Friday, we started this program called Entrepreneurs Change the World, mostly focused on high school and college kids. We're trying to build a much earlier pipeline. So on Friday, they're going to do their pitch competition and their going to present some really bold ideas related to COVID, social justice, and sustainability, which is a big issue with our big companies as well, like Kroger and P&G. Do you have any just final tips for them as they try to put their best foot forward in as short a period of time to kind of sell their vision, their ambition, their authenticity, their tweetable tweet? But and I'm sure they're all going to be taking notes while you speak.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, make sure that you, number one, from a brand perspective, make sure that you can articulate what you're building and why, in 2 sentences or less. I would say that, knowing your audience and who your product is for is going to be incredibly important, because nothing is more relevant than being able to speak from the voice of a consumer as to what she wants and why she's buying your product. And then I would say number 3, it's really important to develop, as an entrepreneur, a network around you, that, you can kind of lean on throughout your entrepreneurial journey.
Perfect. All right, 3 great steps. I think we're going to end on that, because that's a great way to end. We covered a lot of questions.